Right, good morning everybody and welcome to this session. My name is Katie, also known as Insider PhD. I am an API security researcher and I work in technical marketing at a company called Traceable. I'm also like a YouTuber, and I'll be honest, I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to be employed after this talk. I have to say, I am going to be exposing myself as a massive fraud during this whole thing. Because what you've probably come here expecting is to learn some really key insights about API hacking and how difficult it is. And what I'm about to tell you is that it's not, and actually it's actually really easy, and it's just a bunch of silly mistakes. So I'm an API hacker, and here's how I hack everything from the military to AI. This is the standard RSA disclaimer slide. So I'll be honest, when it comes to hacking, I consider myself not like other hackers. I'm not a super elite hacker. I've not got like 30 different screens around me. I'm not James Kettle. I'm never going to be hacking like that because I am kind of an idiot. I'm a grandma when it comes to a lot of really technical stuff, and I have a PhD as well. So to give you some background on like where I came from, I thought I'd start with like a kind of career look. I started my career at 7 years old making Neopets websites. I loved Neopets. It was a great way of getting me as a child really into web development. And I realized like when I was super young, I really want to make websites. That is my goal. So I went to university, I got a bachelor's degree in computer science. I then went and worked at a company that is an actual picture of our server room. We spent an entire weekend untangling all those cables. It was genuinely the worst part of my career. So I did a degree in computer science, and I finished my degree, and I went into work, and I was like, I hate my job. So I did the normal thing. I went and did a PhD in cybersecurity. I never really intended to get in cybersecurity. I kind of got here by accident. Very intentional to get into web development, not so intentional to get into cybersecurity. I basically did like full stack web development, realized I hated my job, only had one choice of PhD, hated my job so much I'm like, well, I guess it will be cybersecurity then. And then I ended up getting a PhD. During my PhD, I had the opportunity to be a mentee at a HackerOne live hacking event. And these are these live hacking events where they fly out the best hackers in the world to like a nice destination, and me, of course, not the good hacker, just there, I guess. It was in London, so that's not too far from where I live. Obviously, I'm British. And I went there, and despite knowing absolutely nothing about cybersecurity, and I mean nothing, like if anybody, can you put your hand up if you do like any kind of web security already? Like maybe you've used Burp before? Okay, you all way more qualified than me. I hadn't even heard of Burp. I'd never seen a request in person. So when I was there, I actually found my first two vulnerabilities, and I found it because of my experience as a developer. Because if you are a developer and you write APIs, you might know about RESTful APIs and know there's a lovely standard that nobody follows. You'll never see a put or a delete request, a delete verb in the wild. You just won't see them. So I found a API that was properly programmed, and I'm like, no human wrote that. No human followed that standard correctly, right? It is definitely vulnerable. A machine made that. And this is me with obviously the most famous person I've ever met, Clippy. And now I do a lot of talks about API hacking and my experience in doing bug bounty hunting. So why APIs? I can read JSON. If you've ever seen like WAF bypasses on Twitter, they're like super long and super complicated, and I'm like, yeah, no. I never wanted to write JavaScript when I was a programmer. I'm certainly not doing it now. And so because I used to make APIs because I really understood JSON, I really was able to kind of tune my brain into API hacking, because API hacking is not about specific payloads necessarily. It's very much about thinking through the logic of an application, and it's a lot of little mistakes. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, And by the end of this talk, you'll have a feel for what little mistakes actually look like and how we can start to prevent them. So again, it's more about logic than payloads. But today I'm going to be awarding myself three competition prizes. The first for the silliest bug I've ever found, the first for the quickest bug I've ever found, and the third for the most complex bug that I've ever found. And hopefully give you a taste of how I think everybody in this room, regardless of whether or not you know anything about hacking, could do API hacking. So we'll start with airports. This bug story I've called Takeoff, and it is the silliest bug I've ever found. So I was hacking it was a live hacking event. It was some kind of airport system. I can't say, like, obviously who the client was for presumably obvious reasons, but essentially it was this application where you could like request flyovers, right? So if you're doing like a fancy event, Remembrance Sunday, or, you know, congratulations defeating the German Day in the UK, if you're like running an event there and you want the red arrows or like an old historic plane to fly over the top, you can request them. And to do that, you had to obviously give some details about the airport, because it turns out you actually can't just fly a plane. You actually need to like take off from somewhere and land somewhere, and you need to calculate the fuel. So anyway, I was having a look at this and I was playing around with it. Now, as I was having a look, one thing you know if you do travel a lot is actually you don't actually need a username and password on any airline booking system. What you need is like a booking reference and your last name. And that's for various reasons. Mostly, they don't want to deal with resetting your password, which I think is fair enough, because I'll tell you what, it's annoying. So in this case, when I was looking at this application, it kind of followed this style of like request, where instead of doing a username and a password or like some kind of secret something, even like last name, like booking reference, they didn't even have that. You could just give it your last name, which is great. That is no passwords required. Unfortunately, your last name is not, as it may be, like private at all, right? You give that to people all the time. You go on LinkedIn, look at people who, you know, organize potentially air shows. You go through LinkedIn, you find the second connection, and you go, I'm going to take your last name, I'm going to paste it into this application. And would you look at that? What I saw was a bunch of runway info about this particular event. Now, you might be thinking, okay, you could go out there to an airport runway and like measure it. Like, you could tell how long the runway is. Now, what you could do on this is not just see it, but you could edit it as well. Now, I'm not an expert in aerospace engineering, but I understand from my younger brother, who is an aerospace engineer, planes can't land big plane, short runway, doesn't work. So you could essentially change this runway to be significantly longer than it was. Now, in terms of like technical, this is not like a super complex bug, right? Like, people in the audience who know stuff about bug bounty hunting or web security will go, you know, that's NIDOR, that's Ebola, it's sensitive data disclosure, whatever. So it's not a particularly sensitive bug, but if you actually think about the impact of it, if you did have an aeroplane and you did have, you know, you lied and said your runway was much longer than it actually was, and this nice historic plane that probably costs a lot of money, I mean, regular planes cost a lot of money, so historic planes certainly do, would land and then go off the edge. Now, obviously, a huge impact there, right? That is not kind of a small vulnerability. That's actually quite large. That could cause somebody to actually die. And this is what the kind of vulnerabilities that I tend to find in APIs tend to be. They're not log4j payloads. They're not, look at this sweet WAF bypass. They're not a script alert one. They are focused very much in how an application works. They're focused very much in the logic of that application and how a regular user is supposed to use it. So story 2, Quizzical. I found this vulnerability in 5 minutes. I'm not even joking. I was setting up the application. I was in my hotel room about to go to, like, I think it was DEF CON. I think I was literally 5 minutes away. I opened it up to have a little bit of a scroll around, and I found a vulnerability immediately. So this was in a mobile app. which is not hard, by the way. If you want to do any mobile app hacking, it's actually super easy. It's not difficult at all. All you need to do is you need to have like a jailbroken iPhone, and that's it. So in this case, it was a mobile app. I had a jailbroken phone. I wasn't even using jailbroken phone. No, I was using an Android emulator. Wasn't even using the jailbroken phone because I don't think I brought it. But it was using an Android emulator. I installed the app. I connected it all up to Burp, and I could see the traffic, which is great. So to give you some background on like mobile app like development, you actually can't on any like mobile app constantly use the antenna because it drains battery. So a lot of like different technologies look to optimize the network access. So when you have a mobile app, you don't just have like an auto-updating thing. If the app's not open, it does it in the background and then it will push an update to you, like a notification or whatever. So you can't just keep it going. And what that means is that developers, when they make mobile apps, have to make decisions. And one of the ways they kind of try to reduce the number of requests they make is using a technology called batching. And it's essentially, instead of sending 3 little requests, you send one big request with all 3 enveloped inside. And PayPal uses it quite a lot. And this is from PayPal's API documentation. So essentially, instead of PayPal doing say, check your balance, make a payment, or then send it to somebody else, they'll do that all in one go. So I was testing a quiz app. Now, a quiz app obviously has questions and obviously has answers. So what do you do when you're trying to reduce the number of requests that you make from your mobile app? Well, you just include the answer when you give them the question, right? Like, why that 2 steps? You just has and is correct on there. Now, unfortunately, for this particular application, you could trade in your correct answers for Amazon gift cards. And obviously, when I saw this, I realized, oh yeah, this is arbitrage. That's what that is. That is free Amazon gift cards with a nice little automation script. And again, I hope that this shows that actually it's thinking through the logic. I wasn't super special to be able to spot that. Like, I'm not super technical, super complex, super hacker, right? I just looked at that and thought, okay, so I could just figure out the correct answer and then just answer the correct answer every time because I could see it and I could just generate free Amazon gift cards. Again, it's not super big. It's not super technical. It's thinking through the logic of the application. So my third vulnerability I've called supply chain. Now, this is by far the most complex bug I've ever found in any application. You're going to be very disappointed, by the way, in what this actually turns out to look like. So this is in something called GraphQL. Now, GraphQL is another way of writing APIs. But unlike RESTful APIs, GraphQL APIs use a scary syntax, so nobody touches them because they're too scared of it. It uses like JSON. You have to write your own queries. It kind of works like, not really like SQL, but in the sense it's its own language. So most hackers are terrified of GraphQL because it's like something different. So anyway, I was testing this application that was using GraphQL, and I saw this multi-part form. Now, multi-part forms are very, very common in most applications. Allows you to upload an image into a form, and then the image data is included in the request. Nothing major. But as I was testing this, I'm like, this is so weird. I've never seen a GraphQL multi-part form. Like, I have no idea what's going on. This is even weirder than regular GraphQL syntaxes. So as I was going through it and I was trying to figure out which parts did which and what file name was and trying to understand it, I did what any good software engineer does when they're stuck. I Googled it, and I was like, what is GraphQL multi-part form? So as I was looking through my Google search results, I got to this particular GitHub repository. So it turns out this is like a new specification that a bunch of different GraphQL servers had signed up for. And they had said, yeah, we want to implement this. So like you do, I started causing some errors, got a nice little Java error, which narrowed down the options, because I was looking through the server list. I'm like, which one is Java? Thank God it wasn't PHP or Python, because there's more than one of them. There was only one Java. And as the amazing security researcher as I am, I went there and I put in CVE, security, like vulnerability, right? I just searched for what it would be vulnerable to. I then did something that I genuinely think is very, very smart, which is I was figuring out version of Jackson Databind it was using by like checking what like software bugs it had. I felt so clever. But realistically, what I'd done is Googled it. I can't really stress enough, like that is the most complex bug I've ever found. Did I have to read the code? Absolutely not. Did I have to understand how the server worked? Kind of. Did I have to know what to Google? Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I think it comes to my point of my presentation, which is, am I actually good at my job? And we'll see whether or not I have a job at the end of this presentation. But fundamentally, none of these bugs are complex. None of my findings are. I've found like loads of vulnerabilities. I've made lots in bug bounty money. I have a big following of 80,000 subscribers on YouTube. My bugs aren't hard. They aren't complex. They aren't really, really technical. Because what I exploit is not software. What I exploit is tiny little mistakes. Not a mistake so small that actually you'd never spot it if you were doing like penetration tests, right? You wouldn't necessarily see it. So why APIs? The reason why I think APIs are particularly vulnerable to these kind of attacks is that there is such a large attack. Your typical API for like a big company can be hundreds of endpoints, and each endpoint will have at least 4 different things you can do on that endpoint. And it grows exponentially. Like it is really, really, really big. And developers often use APIs quite a lot because they're great, like as a technology, as a way of developing. They are really, really flexible for developers. But unfortunately, what it means is that there's loads of opportunities for something small. A missing if statement, a business logic error, a business logic issue that doesn't quite make sense in practice, a missing piece of code that adds middleware to a request. Often with the APIs and standardization, like while there are a bunch of different standards, a lot of people don't implement it correctly because they haven't sat down and read like an RFC ever. I was a developer. I never read an RFC. The first RFC I read was because I was doing a YouTube video about HTTP. Like we just don't teach it. We don't focus on it. And that's, I think, a good thing, right? Like we don't want developers to be panicking about it all the time. But unfortunately, what it leads to is this idea of, well, if it's undocumented, then that's the same as it being internal only. And quite often, developers will develop with the intention of, oh, you know what, this is just like API, no one will ever use it, no one will ever see it. Almost all of the API vulnerabilities that I've found at least are really difficult to test automatically. Like there are some solutions you could go and like do full reconnaissance on an API, but honestly, when people ask me, what API word list do you recommend? The dictionary, because there's hundreds of ways to write something. And heaven forbid one of your developers isn't like an English native speaker, because they may well use English words mixed with their own home language with a lovely, like maybe like different pluralization. All of that can impact what an API attack surface looks like. You know, I'm never expecting to be on this list. I'm never expecting to be one of the world's best web hackers. You know, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. But I am hoping that I can make a change here. So here's an example of some vulnerable code. So this is a piece of Laravel code, because I used to be a Laravel developer. And it essentially creates an API endpoint. It creates like the create, read, update, delete for an API. In this case, this is for a API endpoint called grades. You can create a grade, update a grade, delete a grade, etc. And then you see the except there, that's removing like a form. So that is vulnerable. What is not vulnerable? So for reference, vulnerable, not vulnerable, vulnerable, not vulnerable. Missing thing there is literally just 2 words, right? Middleware auth. Now, if you're not sure what middleware is a type of software that sits between the request and the server and does something before it goes through the full framework. So in this case, this middleware auth line says, hey, before somebody does any of these API actions, can we make sure they're logged in first? And this unauthenticated API, this is so common. We've seen it on car manufacturers. We've seen it on industrial IoT software. I've seen it on the railways. This difference between vulnerable and not vulnerable, it's easy to make, right? You can totally imagine a developer who's busy doing something else, doing this code, forgetting this line, and marking the story on Jira or whatever as complete, right? It's done. You can edit grades, fantastic. Another common one is often if statement. So this is, again, Laravel code, because I used to be a Laravel developer. And what this piece of code does is delete a user with the currently logged on user ID, and then delete a bunch of different tables as well. So this deletes everything. So this is vulnerable. This is not vulnerable. Vulnerable, not vulnerable. The only difference there is that there's a single if statement that says, hey, check they're an admin before they can just delete everything. And I don't want to be dramatic here and be like, look at how vulnerable software is. But this is the kind of small mistakes that can have massive repercussions. If you think about the story about the airport, that's kind of what it was missing, right? It was missing a check. Is this person actually this individual, or missing authentication? So why do they actually happen? So a lot of these vulnerabilities tend to occur because of how we get software engineers to develop software and how they do. So often within a software engineering team, they'll usually be using an agile method. Alternatively, they'll say they're agile and then try their best to have sprints. I've worked with a few software engineering teams. Agile was, hey, can you just do this, please, for me? Thanks. So the idea is that the developers are supposed to sit together with their stakeholders and put together a backlog of all the features they want to implement. Those might start as user stories, but they become essentially features. A developer is measured on how far they get through the sprint backlog in a single sprint. Now, usually what they'll do is for each sprint, maybe it's a week, they'll say we're going to do feature A, B, and C. If you do feature A, B, and C, congratulations, you're a good developer. You get to keep your job. If you don't, you're a bad developer. But you can kind of see where this motivation is going to fail, right? Because this encourages developers to do a bad job. This encourages developers to ship at any cost. And can you blame them, really? If we look at what developers value, I realize the text is very small. This is from Stack Overflow. Well, it's okay because I summarized it on the other side. Developers value code quality, having efficient, easily understood, maintained by others code. I have not yet met a software engineer, by the way, who's gone into a new job and hasn't suggested throwing away the code base and starting again from scratch. That code meets the requirements set out by their product owners or whatever. That code is written quickly. They want to be efficient. That code uses when code meets both the requirements and it's fast to write, that's what they like. Security ends up being the trade-off. They don't value secure code. They value code that is easy to write, that will keep them employed and get through their sprint backlog. And I often get told by developers, why do developers do this? What's wrong with them? I don't blame any developer for doing this. Developers are still in the stage where you'll go to a developer conference, they'll be talking about how to manage technical debt. They are not necessarily, and especially with less mature security teams, they're not ready for this conversation about security. They're already juggling 10 different problems. They're already dealing with people shouting in their ears all the time, get this done, get this shipped, get this feature out. That actually, if there's no vulnerability management, if there's no clear process, what are they going to do? They're just going to do the easy way through. And I think fundamentally with this, you know, this kind of teamwork between security teams and developers isn't something you can buy. Simply buying a new security product is not going to change the fundamental issues of how developers are motivated. And simply yelling at them about how many secure things they have, it's not going to help. And it turns security into the Department of No, it turns it into an antagonistic force, etc. So teamwork isn't something you can buy with a simple product. It's something you need to work on and foster. You need an attitude of that, you know, silly mistakes happen, right? Like, there's no use crying over spilt milk. Like, you are gonna make mistakes as a developer. Here's the process of how we do vulnerability management. Here's how we're gonna make sure this gets fixed. And fundamentally, this has the same priority level as anything else on your sprint backlog. Like, security is as important as shipping something. Even the world's best vulnerability scanner is going to miss the little things. And so I wanted to kind of end on like the kind of what next and what you can do from this. I think fundamentally one is that when we're working with development teams, we need to reward security bug fixes, not just features shipped. Because it's great that we can put OpenAI's API in literally everything. And now we've got an AI app, and it's fantastic, and we can get the VC money in our hands. But if you haven't really thought about, you know, okay, we've implemented this now, how are we going to deal with the security issues around like third-party applications, like third-party OpenAI? If that's not being rewarded the same as putting features in, then we're never going to get over, like we're never going to fix these little mistakes. We've got to disincentivize speed and corner cutting. Again, this kind of goes with like rewarding features, but also we don't want to get features shipped at any cost. Like, there are some costs we're okay with. And you know what? There are some security costs we're okay with. Nobody is expecting 100% secure code. Like, realistically, it's just not feasible. What we're looking for instead is good enough that we're not going to cause a major incident. We as security teams need to work with developers and their flow. Like, my partner is a developer. He does not come with me at security conferences because he finds them too stressful. He's like, I don't want to go there because it makes me feel bad about how much like my code is insecure. I'm still working on him to get a security email address for their company, right? But this is the problem. Like, a lot of developers simply do not want to work with security. They want to work in their own way that they're used to, that they can make their efficient code. Foster a testing culture. Everybody in this room can find a vulnerability. I 100% believe that. No marketing, no nothing. That is my true belief. I think that we all can be security testers, and we all have something unique to find, particularly if our roles have literally nothing to do with technology. I taught my mum's an artist. I taught my mum how to hack. I taught her how to use Burp, in the sense that I was sitting next to her and used the computer, because when she presses the start menu key on a Windows computer, she gets really scared. But it was great YouTube content, so we're okay with that. But she even, you know, at the end of that video, and as I was speaking to her and kind of doing a debrief with her, and I was having this conversation, she was like, I never really realized, you know, what kind of vulnerabilities would be there. I never really thought like a hacker. And then since then, my mum has now sent me every single article that she listens to on BBC Radio 4 about cybersecurity, and she's like, now I'm a hacker now, so I can contribute to that. But it's not just, you know, my mum getting really into cybersecurity. It shows that actually if you do have that conversation with people, that actually they can begin to understand security. And my final point here is build pipelines. You know, and this isn't just CI/CD pipelines. This is like general process pipelines. Make it as easy as possible for developers to not care about security at all. Like, make it so they can kind of have their code tested in like a CI/CD pipeline, or potentially there is a vulnerability management. It goes into their Jira tickets. They can just look at their Jira tickets and then just say that one's done. So I honestly don't know if we're going to resolve all security issues. And I certainly don't think APIs are going to be any more secure by tomorrow. But I do think that we can work together with developers to make things like APIs that often people think of as automatically private, at least a little bit more secure. Thank you very much. Feel free to ask questions. By the way, if you'd like to ask questions, please use the microphones, because the audio person says we need to be able to hear you.
Hi, Katie.
Hello.
I am one of your thousands and thousands of followers on Twitter. A fabulous talk. My name is Becky Gaylord, and I'm a security consultant. And it really seemed like what you described was the definition of vulnerable system, with this pressure to ship at any speed, at any cost, and then deal with security later. I love some of the mitigations you suggested. What would you also suggest by way of controls from a governance perspective, the office of the CISO, perhaps even higher level, to fix the tension that really needs to be corrected? It goes against secure by design, in my view.
So there's several different answers to that. So my first answer is that there has to be a cultural willingness to change. Like both in development practices and in security teams as well, we really can't be going on stage at security conferences and going, developers suck. You're all terrible. Like, stop writing insecure code. We also need to be in a position where we are, being that supportive element to developers. So that's the first thing. One is cultural, and that's, I think, where a CISO can really, really have an advantage of. Our CISO at Traceable is absolutely amazing. He completely understands the trade-off between security and making people's jobs harder, and he advocates for making things easier, for putting in exceptions and that kind of thing. A CISO like that is somebody who tries to bridge that gap, especially within the executive, I think is really valuable. On the side of governance, when it comes to APIs, I think there's a really big role that things like documentation can really play, and developers hate writing it. But you know what? It makes them aware of what is actually out there, what the endpoints are, what the sensitive data it's exposing is, and that kind of thing. So if you are in an API company and you are looking at how do we actually get more security, I actually think going for a governance of document things can be a huge help. And the third thing is just having processes in place. Having a vulnerability management plan, having a SLA maybe potentially for remediation and additional testing. And I think fourth, it's getting developers to start hacking. Hacking is fun. They love it. I do workshops sometimes with companies where I get a bunch of developers to go into a room and start hacking stuff, and they really love it. They want to see this in a slightly different light. Are they going to become the hackers and never going to be offensive security engineers? No, probably not. But does it for them give them an extracurricular activity? Yeah, and they become more aware of security through that. And it's those kind of positive interactions between developers and security that I think, one, can be really fostered, but also it fosters that testing culture.
Thank you. Great ideas.
Hi, related question. So if you were going to pick a couple things just to be final validation before an API was released, for example, do you have a hit list of things you would recommend, more of a technical testing, thinking authentication, maybe Swagger docs or encryption and by design, that type of thing?
So first thing would be check your API actually requires people to be logged in. Genuinely, that is one of the most common findings. It's literally, there is no authentication on the API at all. The second thing is permission levels. I can guarantee whenever I look at an API, whether it's from a small company or an SME or whatever, or it's a massive corporation like Amazon, it is full of permissions issues. A resource doesn't necessarily check that a user owns that resource before letting you edit it. Unfortunately, that is really, really hard to do an automated test for. That is something where a lot of it, so it depends, some products can automatically test it. but actually that's really hard to do an automated test for. You kind of have to do it manually. And the other thing is just sensitive data. Like, just know whether or not it outputs sensitive data. Those three things I think would make me very poor, because I would get no more bug bounty income ever.
So maybe further review if there was sensitive data involved, make sure there's authorization checks in there.
Yeah,
and then
just,
make sure authentication's
or
on.
even if you need that sensitive data there, right? Like,
yeah, a lot of times you do.
I think a lot of the time no one really thinks about it. They're just like, API, I'm going to include every single column in the database, because then if I need a column that I didn't put in originally, it will already be there in the API endpoint, and then I won't have to write any more code. That kind of thing, where they just go, okay, so every single column in that table is going to be in the API endpoint.
Yeah,
Just
right.
thinking that through.
Tough to do automated or
Yeah.
at scale, but yeah, so those would be the things you deep dive into a little more.
Yeah.
An architecture type review.
And that's the thing. I think all of these, and my findings in general, are ones that are really difficult to put in automated tests for. Because I tell you what, if it was, then there would be no security vulnerabilities like this.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for stating the obvious of not mentioning AI. So, but how do you integrate? So is there static code analysis that can be implemented as part of testing for this?
For sure. Because I work in a bug bounty context most of the time, I'm doing black box testing. So for me, I'm mainly looking on the outside and just kind of peering in and prodding it. But yeah, certainly you can do. I have met folks who do both code review manually and do more static code analysis. I actually had a really interesting project for a student. I'm also an academic on my free time. I had a student who actually did static code testing for all of the OWASP API top 10. I'm like, you should go apply to a conference. And he was like, I don't want to. Well, but they do exist. And I think at the moment that a lot of the static code ones tend to be more research projects than ready to go. But certainly if you are looking at API specifically, there are like API security products. So, yeah.
Hi, great talk. Really enjoyed it. Learned a lot.
Thank you.
I am not a technical person in this space. I am going to be helping manage an effort that includes creating a new API from scratch to do a certain task. The API is going to be installed by lots of people on lots of servers. Do you have any suggestions for resources for the non-technical person to help encourage the types of behaviors that you're talking about here?
Oh, that's a really good question.
In other words, what's a poor manager to do?
So I'm going to answer in several different ways. One is that with your development team, make sure they're just aware of security and also just general development like issues. There are some really great newsletters, API Secure. API Security IO, Dev2, and oh, my mind's gone blank. The Nordic APIs also has a blog. Those are really great resources, and they often sneak security in. Like API security is very like, here's some API attacks. But for things like Nordic APIs, their blog, they often like throw in security at the bottom. Other things to do is I would really encourage like some of the work of like Casey John Ellis. He has this really great way he talks about thinking like a hacker and getting developers to think like a hacker when they're developing it and to push each other in that direction, I think is really great. I would really recommend that with developers, starting that conversation around security, if you start talking at governance and documentation, it tends to be in the same language that they understand. Like make sure your APIs are documented and you're using Postman. Stuff like that will eventually push them towards security. It's kind of like, you know, when you have children's recipes where you mash up like a banana and you like hide the banana in a muffin so that way they're getting less sugar. It's kind of like that, but for developers, like hidden vegetable security. other things, you know, I think even giving them the opportunity to go to conferences where security is also being talked about, especially for those who could be, say, identified as like a security kind of advocate, offering them some kind of benefit can help too. But honestly, it's hard, especially if your API is going to be like deployed massively at scale to a bunch of different people, because those silly mistakes will slip in. Sweet. Well, I will get off the stage and stop talking, but I'll still be here for 10 minutes in case anybody wants to chat one-on-one. Thank you.